In the autumn of 2025, an ordinary field in Essex began giving up pieces of an airplane that had disappeared there more than 80 years earlier. There was no fuselage waiting beneath the surface, no cockpit that could be opened, and no wing that could be lifted whole from the earth. Instead, soil passed through screens and fragments appeared one by one. Charred perspex, pieces of cockpit equipment, engine metal, wing material, machine gun components, objects small enough to disappear in a handful of dirt. By the end of the operation, nearly 5,000 artifacts and aircraft fragments had been recovered from an area covering more than 2,300 square meters. Together, they belonged to a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt known as Lucky Boy. The airplane had been found in the only form it could still be found, but the reason so many people had returned to this field was not simply to recover an old fighter. The pilot who had disappeared with it in 1944, Second Lieutenant Lester Leo Lowry, had never been officially accounted for. To understand why a search for one man required excavating such a large area, the story has to return to the morning when Lucky Boy was still a complete aircraft. On the 26th of January 1944, Lowry took off from RAF Bodney in Norfolk. He was 23 years old and served with the 487th Fighter Squadron of the 352nd Fighter Group. That day, he was not heading toward occupied Europe. He was not escorting bombers, attacking a target, or entering combat. He was taking part in a training flight. 4 P-47s were involved. Lowry was flying the last aircraft in the formation. The Thunderbolt was a large, powerful, single-seat fighter built around the Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine. Its size makes what happened next easier to understand. The formation entered thick cloud during a diving maneuver. Visibility deteriorated. The maneuver continued into the cloud. Lowry's P-47 emerged from it still descending. Exactly what happened during those moments cannot now be reconstructed with certainty. There is no need to invent a final cockpit drama where the records do not provide one. What is known is simpler. Lucky Boy continued downward in a steep, high-speed dive and struck open ground in Essex. There was no evidence of a successful bailout. Accounts describe the impact as extremely steep, with one later archaeological summary giving an angle of about 60 degrees. The precise number matters less than the physical result. The fighter did not leave an intact wreck sitting on the field. It entered the field. The impact destroyed the aircraft and drove wreckage into the ground. Instead of a recognizable fuselage with wings attached, there was a crater filled with broken structure, engine material, cockpit parts, armament components, burned debris, and soil. The site continued to smolder for days. When the area became safe enough to investigate, the authorities could identify where Lowry's aircraft had crashed. What they could not do was recover Lowry. That distinction would define the next 8 decades. Knowing the location of a crash is not the same thing as recovering everything that entered it. In a steep, high-speed ground impact, an aircraft can fragment violently. Different parts separate, deform, and penetrate the soil in different ways. Some remain comparatively large, others become pieces only a few centimeters across. Once dirt collapses back into the crater and the surface is restored, the crash is no longer a single object under the ground. It is a distribution of evidence. For the people who searched in 1944, that problem was immediate. They had a known site, but not a recoverable pilot. Then the visible signs of the crash began to disappear. The field returned to agricultural use, seasons passed. The crater ceased to be the obvious wound it had been immediately after the impact. Below the surface, however, Lucky Boy remained scattered through the earth. The aircraft's nickname survived more neatly in records than the aircraft itself survived in the field. Decades later, searchers came back. In 1979, the Essex Aviation Group excavated the site. It was an earlier, amateur investigation, rather than the kind of controlled forensic excavation that would come later. The group recovered aircraft components, including material associated with the propeller and the armament. Their work confirmed again that substantial wreckage remained beneath the field, but Lowry was not found. That mattered because by this point, the central mystery was no longer the location of the airplane. The location had been known since the day it crashed. Pieces had been taken from the site. The history of the aircraft could be traced. The missing part of the story was still the man in the cockpit. In 2018, specialists from the Defense POW MIA accounting agency returned to examine the location. Their survey concluded that the site justified a professional recovery effort. That decision changed the scale of the problem. A conventional image of aircraft recovery begins with a visible wreck. Divers locate a fuselage in a lake, a crane takes the weight, mud is cleared from a wing. The airplane may be damaged, corroded, or incomplete, but it still exists as an object. There would be no such moment in Essex. The team returning to Lucky Boy would have to recover a crash field. By September and October of 2025, a major operation was underway. The Defense POW MIA accounting agency worked with Cotswold Archaeology and Operation Nightingale. Across the excavation, nearly 250 volunteers became involved. More than 130 United States Air Force and Army personnel were among those assigned in support. Archaeologists, researchers, military personnel, veterans, local volunteers, and selected metal detectorists all took part. Their objective was specific. They were not trying to rebuild Lucky Boy into a museum aircraft. They were not looking for enough large parts to create the outline of a P-47 on a hangar floor. They were trying to recover and document evidence from the crash and to find anything that could help account for Lester Lowry. That required a different way of thinking about the site. More than 2,300 square meters were surveyed. Geophysical work helped identify features beneath the surface. Controlled machine stripping removed layers of soil. Metal detectorists checked exposed areas. Excavated material was not simply pushed aside, it was processed. At first, the scene could look almost backward for an aircraft recovery. Heavy machinery opened the site, but the decisive work increasingly happened at screens and sorting areas. Soil was broken down, material passed through dry screens. Other deposits were wet screens so that clay and dirt could be washed away while solid objects remained. The reason becomes clear once the fragments begin to appear. A large engine component is difficult to miss. A piece of aircraft structure the size of a hand is easier to overlook. A small fitting, a sliver of burned cockpit material, or an item connected to a pilot's equipment can vanish completely if the soil containing it is treated as spoil. Screening turns that problem around. Instead of asking whether a fragment is large enough to notice while digging, the process separates the earth from whatever does not belong to the earth. And then Lucky Boy begins to emerge. Not all at once, a fragment at a time. Charred perspex from the windshield still showed clear evidence of burning. Other pieces could be associated with cockpit controls. A wing trim dial was among the identifiable cockpit-related finds. Engine components appeared. Material from the wings came out of the ground. Parts associated with the aircraft's machine guns were recovered as well. Each piece was physically small compared with the original aircraft. Together, they began to reconstruct its presence across the site. This is the point where the scale of the recovery becomes easier to understand. The team was not searching one crater until someone reached a buried cockpit. They were dealing with a debris field whose useful evidence could be spread through a large volume of soil. A single dramatic discovery could never tell the whole story. The excavation had to succeed through repetition. Expose another controlled area. Check it. Detect it. Remove the soil. Screen it. Wash it. Sort what remains. Record what has been found. Then do it again. The rhythm of that work matters because it explains why the operation lasted weeks rather than hours. A high-speed crash can produce thousands of fragments, but archaeology cannot treat them as an anonymous pile. Once removed from the ground, an object without context loses part of what makes it useful. The recovery, therefore, had to preserve not just the object, but the relationship between that object and the area where it was found. To a casual observer, many pieces might look anonymous. bent metal, burned material, broken fittings, fragments without the shape that once made their purpose obvious. But archaeological recovery depends on context as much as appearance. Where something is found, what lies near it, what material it is made from, and what recognizable features survive can all help determine how it fits into the larger crash. The P-47 was gradually returning not as a machine, but as a pattern. Pieces associated with the cockpit established part of that pattern. Engine debris established another. Wing and armament material extended it. The recovered objects showed that the site retained evidence from multiple major areas of the aircraft, despite the original impact, the passage of 81 years, and the earlier excavation in 1979. The number of finds kept growing. Hundreds became thousands. By the end of the operation, nearly 5,000 artifacts and aircraft fragments had been recovered. It would have been easy to treat that number as the climax. For an aviation archaeology project, it was a remarkable volume of material from a single wartime crash site. But the largest question in the field had never been how many parts of a Thunderbolt could be collected. The reason the Defense POW MIA accounting agency was there was Lester Lowry. And as the excavation moved through the debris, the categories of recovered material began to shift. Alongside airframe components came objects associated with uniform and life support equipment. These were different from an engine fragment or a piece of wing skin. They belonged to the environment immediately around the pilot. That change is subtle, but it transforms the meaning of the excavation. An engine fragment tells you about the airplane. A cockpit control brings you closer to where the pilot sat. An item from personal or life support equipment belongs to the space between aircraft archaeology and the accounting mission that brought the team back. One reported find was interpreted as a buckle from an unused parachute harness. That detail had to be handled carefully. It did not prove a complete sequence of events inside the cockpit, and it did not justify inventing a final decision by Lowry. But it sat beside something already known from the crash in 1944. There had been no evidence of a successful bailout. Now, more than 8 decades later, the field was returning equipment associated with the man who had remained with the airplane. This was also where the purpose of careful recovery became clearest. A large, recognizable aircraft part can answer a simple question quickly. Yes, this is the crash site. Yes, a P-47 came down here. But by 2025, no one needed thousands of hours of work merely to prove that Lucky Boy had crashed in Essex. The more important questions required smaller evidence and greater caution. Was material associated with Lowry still present? Could the distribution of wreckage narrow the search? Could objects connected with his equipment help investigators understand where evidence relating to him might survive? And, most importantly, had anything been recovered that could eventually allow the United States government to account for him? The archaeological team could recover material from the ground. It could document where that material came from. It could preserve the relationship between objects and the crash site. What it could not do in the field was turn every possible discovery into an identification. Recovery and identification are separate stages. Any possible human remains would require formal laboratory examination. That distinction prevents one of the easiest mistakes to make in a story like this. Finding something that may be associated with a missing serviceman is not the same as proving identity. For the people working in Essex, that meant the excavation could be physically successful while the final answer remained elsewhere. The operation continued to process the field. More soil moved through screens, more fragments were washed clean. More pieces were sorted into a record of an airplane that had ceased to exist as an airplane on the afternoon it struck the ground. There is a particular irony in that process. The P-47 Thunderbolt had been built as a machine of mass and force. Its engine defined much of the aircraft around it. Its wings carried heavy armament. Yet the most important work in recovering Lucky Boy often came down to preventing tiny objects from slipping through soil unnoticed. The recovery became less about lifting weight and more about protecting information. That is what separated the 2025 excavation from the image most people have of salvage. There was no moment when cables tightened and the fighter rose from the earth. No crowd watched a fuselage break the surface. No restoration team received a complete airframe at the end. Instead, the achievement was cumulative. A cockpit fragment here, an engine piece there, a machine gun component, a charred piece of perspex, a control dial, an object from life support equipment. Each one was limited on its own. Together, they changed how completely the crash site could be understood. They also showed why the original search had faced such a difficult task. The people who arrived after the crash in 1944 were not looking at a neat wreck. They were looking at the immediate result of a violent impact, with fire, damaged soil, and aircraft structure driven into the ground. The fact that Lowry could not be recovered then no longer seemed mysterious in the simple sense of someone having searched the wrong place. The site itself was the problem. Much of the aircraft, including material associated with the cockpit, had been broken into that site. By 2025, archaeology offered a way to approach the same ground differently. Not by expecting one decisive object, but by accepting that the physical record of the crash might be distributed across thousands of small ones. The excavation eventually ended. The field had produced evidence from the cockpit, fuselage, wings, engine, armament, and equipment associated with the pilot. Almost 5,000 finds had been brought into the recovery process. What happened next required a different kind of patience. Possible human remains, if recovered, could not be identified by appearance or by association alone. They would have to enter the formal accounting and laboratory process used by the United States government. As of August 2026, no official Defense POW MIA accounting agency identification announcement for Lester Leo Lowry had been located. That does not erase what the excavation accomplished. For decades, Lucky Boy existed in two very different forms. In wartime records, it remained an identifiable P-47 attached to a named pilot and a known date. In the field, it existed as scattered metal, burned material, and personal equipment distributed through the earth. The 2025 operation brought those two forms closer together. The team did not restore the aircraft, it restored context. Pieces that had been mixed with soil were recovered, cleaned, recorded, and associated again with the crash. Areas that had looked like ordinary farmland became parts of a mapped wartime site. Fragments too small to resemble an airplane individually became evidence of where that airplane had gone. There was never going to be one recovered airframe at the end of this operation. The result was not an airplane. It was a record of an airplane. The most truthful image is therefore a small one. A hand holding a fragment that once belonged to the cockpit. A screen full of stones, soil, and one piece of aircraft metal. A tray containing cleaned objects that survived because someone stopped to separate them from the earth. In 1944, investigators knew where the Thunderbolt had ended, but they could not recover its pilot. In 1979, searchers brought more of the aircraft back to the surface, but the central question remained. In 2018, specialists decided the field still held enough evidence to justify another return, and in 2025, a systematic excavation finally treated the entire crash area as the wreck. Piece by piece, Lucky Boy came back out of the ground. The engine was represented by fragments, the cockpit by fragments, the wings and armament by fragments. Even equipment associated with the pilot survived in pieces. The excavation has an ending. The finds were recovered, documented, and passed into further analysis. The accounting story does not yet have the same ending. Until an official identification resolves it, Lester Lowry remains the unanswered part of the recovery. 81 years after Lucky Boy disappeared into the ground, almost 5,000 pieces came back out. They can tell investigators where the Thunderbolt ended and how much of its final trace remained beneath an ordinary Essex field. Whether those traces can finally account for Lester Lowry is a question the field itself cannot answer.